It took him less than a minute to erase 18 years of my life. One moment I was reviewing quarterly system logs, and the next, standing outside the building with a sealed envelope and no job. My name is Daniel Cole. I'm 54. Until recently, I led systems engineering for a logistics tech firm in Austin. I wasn't some big-name exec, but I'd built things that worked, lasted, and kept the company running long after others had moved on. I'm married, 22 years to my wife, Linda. She works in corporate real estate. We have 2 adult children, both living independently now, building their own lives. We did what most people do, worked hard, paid the bills, showed up when it counted. Ours was the kind of life that looked solid from the outside, not dramatic, not perfect, just steady. Easy to maintain. Easier not to question. I didn't fight the decision. No heated words, no email afterward, no effort to change their minds. I just packed my things and walked out. It wasn't the first time the company had gutted whole departments, and I knew the new management had been eyeing salaries like mine. Still, I thought I had more time. Thought my work spoke for itself. I was wrong. The drive home was quiet. No radio, no calls. I parked in the garage, stepped into the kitchen, and stood there longer than I meant to. The coffee maker blinked its usual 12 o'clock. Everything in the house was exactly where it had always been, and yet I felt like a visitor in my own routine. Linda was still at work when I got back. I didn't call her. I just sat at the kitchen table, let the silence settle around me, and tried to imagine what Monday would look like without emails, meetings, or check-ins. For the first time in 2 decades, no one needed anything from me by noon. I told her that evening. She took it as I expected, calmly, efficiently. Asked about severance, insurance, next steps. She didn't panic. I appreciated that. But she also didn't sit down next to me, didn't put a hand on my shoulder, didn't look me in the eye for more than a moment. The next few days were a blur of structure I didn't quite believe in. I kept getting up early, kept making the same coffee, kept pretending that I had somewhere to be. I fixed a loose fence post. Reorganized the garage. Took a walk around the neighborhood every morning, past the same houses I used to drive by without noticing. It helped. A little. Friends from work reached out. Not many, and not for long. Some offered to grab lunch, others just texted vague condolences before disappearing back into the current I'd fallen out of. I didn't blame them. People move on fast. Especially when you're the reminder that everything is temporary. Linda's schedule didn't change. In fact, she seemed busier. More video calls. More nights. Working late. She said the market was shifting. That the office was under pressure. That made sense. She'd always been steady, detail-focused. But the house felt quieter, colder, like something had left along with my title. She changed her passwords. Started leaving her phone face down. She began showering at night, a shift from her usual morning routine. Her scent changed. I noticed. A new perfume, heavier, sharper. She had said once that floral gave her migraines, but now it lingered in the hallway long after she left for work. The house used to be filled with small conversation. Grocery lists, weekend plans, notes about the kids. Now, we passed each other in silence more often than not. She wasn't cruel. Just absent. Present in body, absent in every other way. I didn't accuse. I didn't ask questions. It was too early for that. Too circumstantial. Instead, I began paying attention. Not obsessively, just carefully. Quietly. Like watching for hairline fractures in concrete. Then one evening, as I returned from my usual walk, I found her asleep on the couch. The television was still on, muted. Her wine glass half full. Her phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't move. Just watched as the screen lit up and faded. There was no name. Just a preview. Made it back. You. I told myself it was nothing. But part of me knew. That was the first crack, quiet, sharp, and deeper than I wanted to admit. A few days after I walked out of Lincor, the first message landed in my inbox. It was from a former junior developer I had trained years ago, polite, brief, slightly panicked. He couldn't find a config script I'd written to bypass a legacy API problem during downtime syncs. I remembered that script. I also remembered that he had once told me it was unnecessary overengineering. I didn't respond. Then came the second message, from infrastructure. Something about a memory leak in the logging container. They tried patching it but couldn't trace the origin. I had traced it once 3 years ago. Isolated the issue, built a patch by hand, never documented it because I never thought I'd need to explain it. I didn't reply to that message either. Within a week, they were calling. Not just engineers. Team leads. Managers. Even someone from compliance. Each request came wrapped in polite uncertainty. They didn't say, "We need you." But it was there, under the words, in the careful tone. The new systems lead wasn't up to it. Of course he wasn't. He was good on paper. Said all the right things in interviews. But Lincor wasn't just a company. It was 100 interwoven dependencies, and I was the only one who had touched every piece. They had assumed I could be replaced. Now, backups weren't syncing. Routing tables were off. Security protocols were failing silently, the worst kind of failure. One team lead wrote that data isn't moving the way it used to. That was their phrase. I read it twice. I knew what it meant. They were losing visibility into their own operations. Still, I said nothing. Then, a director I hadn't heard from in years reached out, direct message, after hours. Friendly tone. Said he? Missed my brain in the room. Said maybe I could advise? Maybe just for a week or two. Nothing formal. No pressure. I didn't even open the message fully. Just read the preview and archived it. This was what they didn't understand. I didn't leave that place. I was pushed out. Quietly, cleanly, and without cause. My role was too expensive. And now, the same people who had nodded through my exit wanted me to clean up their mistakes. But I wasn't angry. I was observant. Each day brought more evidence that the system was folding in on itself. Misrouted inventory. Overloaded containers. Delays stacking in the warehouse queues. I saw complaints surfacing on public boards. Vendor frustration. Slipping metrics. Their silence was louder than any apology. Linda was working late again. I didn't ask questions. I made my coffee. Walked the trails. Repaired a broken door hinge. And each evening, when I checked my inbox, I found more quiet desperation, more people trying to reverse a decision they never had the courage to question when it mattered. They thought I was just a cog. They forgot who built the clock. At night, I found myself reviewing old files. Not to help them, just to remember. The structure, the logic, the silent architecture I'd lived inside for years. It was elegant in its own way. Not beautiful, but dependable. Like I used to be to them. And with each new message, each new failure, I realized something. I didn't want revenge. I wanted them to understand the cost of absence. And then, just as I was beginning to move on, the system collapsed. They didn't announce it. But I saw it, in the phrasing of their emails, the escalation, the panic they tried to soften with professionalism. Their network was failing. The integrations I had stabilized were now at war with each other. And the person they chose to replace me was asking the same questions I had solved 5 years ago. And that was only the beginning. What happened after that, no one could have seen coming. Not even me. The first call came just after 8 in the morning. I was in the garage, rearranging shelves I hadn't touched in years, when my phone rang. It was a number from the company directory, one I still recognized. I let it go to voicemail. Then came another. And another. By noon, I had 6 missed calls. 1 from infrastructure. 1 from compliance. 3 from engineering. And 1 from a senior executive, the same one who had once told me, through a third party, that my cost-to-impact ratio wasn't competitive anymore. Now, suddenly, they wanted to talk. Not by email. Not politely. They wanted me back. And not just for consultation, for control. Something had gone very wrong. Something bigger than a few failed deployments or missed deadlines. I could hear it in the pace of the messages they left. One voice, clearly flustered, mentioned a systems-wide regression. Another said, "We lost the entire March audit trail." A third, lower, urgent, admitted they couldn't even access core reporting for real-time logistics tracking. Which meant they were flying blind. Which meant things were worse than I thought. That same week, someone from IT leaked an internal memo to a group chat I'd quietly stayed in after leaving. The memo was labeled confidential. It detailed a multi-layer infrastructure failure that had resulted in unlogged inventory shifts across 3 states. Millions in goods were now unverifiable. The company's tracking system, the one I'd written, was being patched by people who didn't understand what lived beneath the surface. They were guessing. And it wasn't working. That's when the offer came. A direct message, this time not from engineering, not from a friend, but from the office of the CEO. They weren't just asking for advice anymore. They were offering my old job back. Same title. New terms. Discretion guaranteed. I would report directly. I would have full autonomy. The message even implied that the CTO, the man who replaced me, might be moved to a more strategic role. They were ready to sacrifice their own to get me back. And still, I didn't respond. Because I had already started something else. A few days after my layoff, a contact from a mid-size freight firm in Dallas had reached out, asking if I'd be open to helping them modernize their tech stack. Nothing big, he said. Just a few advisory sessions. I'd said no at the time, still too raw, too uncertain. But I'd saved his number. Now I called him back. Within a week, I was drawing diagrams again. Not for Lincor. For someone else. Someone smart enough to ask the right questions, and smart enough to let me answer them without interference. I didn't tell Linda. I didn't tell anyone. I just started building. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. Because I had given Lincor everything. And when they thought they no longer needed me, they threw me away. Now they wanted to hand it all back, as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't the same person anymore. And I had no interest in rebuilding what they'd broken. I had something better in mind. And when they found out what I was really doing, it was already too late. I never planned to expose them. At least not at first. My only goal, when I began consulting for the Dallas firm, was to move forward, build something clean, stable, insulated from politics. They gave me room. They asked thoughtful questions. They didn't measure value by the size of a salary but by what actually worked. It was quiet, focused work. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to defend my own competence. But Lincor kept calling. They rotated messengers, softened their tone, escalated offers. One message included an NDA draft, unsigned. Another came with a clause offering creative compensation, which I interpreted as desperation masked in legal language. Their house was on fire, and they wanted the architect back, the one they'd thrown out for using the wrong kind of brick. And still, I said nothing. Instead, I kept working. The Dallas system grew quickly. What I had once built over a decade I now rebuilt in weeks, smarter, faster, without the weight of corporate interference. The architecture was modular, transparent, scalable. I could see it taking shape, layer by layer, like something that already knew how to stand on its own. I knew it would outperform Lincor's system within months. But what happened next wasn't my doing. It started with a logistics conference. A small one, not even industry-wide. The Dallas firm asked me to speak, casually, on the evolution of freight system architecture. I agreed. No slides, no spotlight. Just a quiet room with operators, planners, and CTOs looking for practical ideas. I didn't mention Lincor. I just showed them what I'd built. Afterward, a man approached me. Mid-40s, sharp, soft-spoken. He worked with a national carrier, a client of Lincor's. Or rather, former client. They had dropped their contract 3 weeks earlier after multiple systemic failures. He said he liked what I presented. Said it was clear, direct, and most importantly, it worked. He asked if we could talk. That conversation led to 3 more. And then to a pilot project. Within 6 weeks, my system was running test operations across 3 regional hubs. Without bugs. Without downtime. Without apologies. Then the real message came. Not to me. To Lincor. Their biggest client, the one that made up nearly 18% of their annual revenue, was leaving. Quietly. Efficiently. For a more reliable solution. The Dallas firm had secured the contract. And the system they were using? Mine. I didn't gloat. I didn't even mark the moment. But the timing was clear. And so was the message. Lincor didn't just lose me. They lost the future I was already building. A few days later, another call came. This one I answered. A former colleague, someone I'd once mentored, just wanted to talk. Off the record. He said the company was in full damage control. He said the CTO had resigned. That layoffs were on the table again. That the word collapse was being used in closed meetings. He said some people blamed me. That made me pause. Not out of guilt. Out of accuracy. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't leaked code. I hadn't whispered to clients. I had simply let their own weight pull them under. And in the silence that followed, I'd built something better, not to spite them, but to remind myself that I still could. I hung up the call. Sat back. Watched the sun crawl across the kitchen tiles. And for the first time in months, I felt something settle in my chest, not victory. Not even peace. Just the quiet, dignified weight of being right. But this wasn't the end. Because what I uncovered next went far deeper than broken systems. I thought I had closed the door. Let the company collapse. Let the system fail. Let them rebuild from ashes they poured themselves. I had moved on, or so I believed. But closure is never that clean. It started with a storage drive I hadn't touched in months. I was looking for a network topology file I'd sketched during a late-night deployment 2 years back. I didn't even remember saving it. But as I clicked through folders, I stumbled on something else, a directory labeled Q2 Review. Inside were budget forecasts. Departmental cost-cutting proposals. Nothing unusual at first. I'd seen a dozen of these over the years. But then I saw a spreadsheet where certain positions were color-coded. My role was one of 3 marked in orange, beside a column labeled High Cost, Low Optics. Next to that, in a different font, someone had written, Consider phase-out by end of fiscal. The document was dated nearly 3 months before they let me go. It wasn't the existence of the document that unsettled me. It was the sender, internal finance. Not engineering. Not operations. The directive had come from another tier entirely, one I had never been part of. And in the CC line, listed without bold or emphasis, was a name I hadn't expected to see. Linda. Just there, like any other regional manager. Like someone involved. It could have meant anything. A copied report. An oversight. A mistake. Or not. I didn't confront her. There was nothing to accuse. I didn't even let it show on my face. But after that day, I watched more closely. The way she paused before asking how my day had been. The way she never once mentioned the company again, not even when it made local news for its data breach. The way she switched to direct deposit on all her accounts, even the ones we used to review together. It wasn't guilt. It was preemption. That same week, I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Not a colleague. A contractor. Logistics consultant. We'd worked briefly on a cross-state routing overhaul, not important at the time. But now he was in charge of a major carrier's supply redesign, and he had a question for me. Did I remember how Lincor managed to hide latency inside their forecast models? It was an odd question. One that suggested more than technical interest. So I asked why. He hesitated, then said, "Because your name still shows up in their audits." That got my attention. He sent me a report, anonymized, but I recognized the structure. They were still using tools I'd written. But now those tools were flagging anomalies. Delays. Buried variables. Someone had built a workaround on top of my code, badly. It was hiding real-time bottlenecks, then blaming vendor lag. Someone was masking failure. I saved the report. Not to retaliate. Just to understand the shape of what was forming. Because if someone inside Lincor was tampering with the system, using remnants of my work to shield themselves, then that collapse wasn't just technological. It was criminal. And if Linda had seen any part of it, even in passing, that made everything more delicate. Again, no accusations. No scenes. Just adjustments. I began reviewing our finances with a sharper eye. She had opened a new investment account. Solo. Quiet. Legal. But curious in timing. I noticed she'd started shifting her schedule, traveling more. Said it was for work? It probably was. Still, I copied every document. Photographed every tax return. Took screenshots of shared portals. I wasn't preparing for war. I was preparing for clarity. Because sometimes betrayal isn't in the act. It's in the silence around it. And as I built my new platform, watched Lincor implode, and tracked whispers from inside their own infrastructure, I knew I was approaching something deeper than bad management. Something buried. And I wasn't walking into it unarmed. Because what I found next, it didn't just change the story. It rewrote everything I thought I knew. The invitation came in a padded envelope. No return address, but the logo was unmistakable. Lincor's annual investor briefing, held every spring in Dallas. I hadn't attended in years. Never like those rooms, polished, overlit, designed to impress people who didn't understand what they were being shown. Inside the envelope was a printed card, no handwritten note. Just a typed message thanking me for my contributions over the years, and offering me a special guest seat at the event. Strategic wording. Empty courtesy. A last-ditch attempt at relevance. I didn't RSVP. I showed up. I arrived early unnoticed. Took a seat in the back, behind the press row. The presentation began on time, sharp suits, expensive visuals, stock images of freight terminals and smiling staff. Nothing real. Just brand noise. Then came the charts. That's when it started to unravel. The presenter, a VP I'd never met, clicked through a slide showing system performance over the past quarter. But the numbers didn't track. They had smoothed over their Q3 crash with language like temporary volatility and transitional logistics indexing. But I had the raw data. And I knew they were lying. Worse, they were lying badly. The anomaly rates were impossible to miss. Even a junior analyst could have seen the pattern. Latency anomalies exactly 12 hours apart, across multiple geographies. Automated buffering. Someone was hiding delays. And I knew who had built that buffer. Me. Years ago, as a failsafe. A mechanism to buy time during cyber attacks or weather disruptions. It wasn't meant to be permanent. It was meant to be used once, briefly, and only under crisis protocols. Now, they had built their entire quarterly report on it. After the presentation, I didn't approach the stage. I didn't need to. I had already submitted an anonymous audit to their primary investor the night before. With timestamps, code samples, metadata. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. That night, at home, I printed out a single page from that audit. I left it on the kitchen counter. Linda saw it when she came in. She glanced at the page, then at me, then back down. No questions. No reaction. Just a slow exhale. That was when I knew. She wasn't surprised. We ate dinner in silence. Nothing heavy, just leftovers. But the silence had changed shape. It wasn't avoidance. It was awareness. A shared understanding that something had shifted, not outwardly, but inside the geometry of our life. She didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't offer. But as she loaded the dishwasher, she paused, just for a moment, and said, "I saw your name in the investor notes." She said it flatly. No warmth. No malice. Just observation. I nodded. That was all. Because that's what the confrontation really was. Not shouting. Not scandal. Just the simple moment when two people stopped pretending not to know the truth. And I still hadn't played my last card. Because while Lincor's board scrambled, and their investors whispered, I had already begun building the next phase, a shared platform, distributed across 3 partner companies, using my architecture under a new name. Linda didn't know that yet. Neither did anyone else. And I would keep it that way. For now. Because the real power isn't in what you reveal. It's in what they still don't see coming. Things fall apart slowly. But when they do, everything collapses at once. 3 weeks after Lincor's investor briefing, their stock was frozen by the SEC. The press blamed. Reporting irregularities. Internal documents had surfaced that contradicted the company's public narrative. It wasn't a surprise to me. I had written the internal tools that gathered those metrics, and someone had been rewriting my reports to hide latency, delay, collapse. I knew who that someone was. Ethan Walters, Director of Architecture. He was brought in 2 quarters before my termination. Young, ambitious, all presentation and no structure. He told the board he could modernize everything. That my work was legacy bloat. They believed him. Then they made room for his vision, by cutting me. What they didn't know was that he hadn't just pushed for my removal. He'd gone further. He'd gotten close to Linda. At first, I assumed they were just collaborating. Then came a forwarded email, a personal one. The tone wasn't professional. It wasn't even cautious. It was intimate. And worse, it was dated 3 weeks before I was dismissed. They weren't just coordinating. They were planning. But it didn't last. Because now Ethan was trying to save himself. He started contacting Linda again, not romantically. Desperately. He was under investigation, and the paper trail of his override code led back to her access credentials. He wanted her to clarify the chain of decisions. She was involved, whether she liked it or not. And now he was threatening her. She came to me. Not with love. Not with regret. With fear. She said she was sorry for how things unfolded. That she didn't know how far Ethan would go. She asked if we could find our way back. She even cried. But I didn't. Because what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had archived everything. Every access log, every altered document, every buried report Ethan submitted under my name. I had it all. Legally. And I had already sent it, anonymously, to the SEC and 2 of Lincor's institutional investors. She moved out quietly. But she returned, to court. At the hearing, she cried again. This time for the judge. Said she was misled. That she had been drawn in by someone she didn't understand. She asked for mediation. I said nothing. The documents spoke for me. We divorced within the month. No contest. No alimony. No public records of accusation, just clean lines and signatures. She walked out alone. No handshake. No eye contact. Meanwhile, the system I built in Dallas expanded. Quietly. Across state lines. Across sectors. But that wasn't the end. Because in one of Ethan's messages, buried deep in metadata, was a reference to a shell company, built on stolen code. My code. He had tried to clone my architecture, white-label it overseas, and claim it as his own. So I called my daughter, the one Linda never trusted. Told her to prepare the file. This time, we'd go all the way. Not out of revenge. Out of precision. Because in the end, it's not who takes the stage that matters. It's who built the floor they're standing on. Subscribe if you want more stories about real men who don't shout. They act. Cold. To the end.